Awesome. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody, depending on where you're joining us from. And welcome to our first ever GPOD Speaks series. GPOD Speaks is a unique initiative, actually suggested by a few of our fellows. I remember Leah, Tristan, some of our fellows, which involves our fellows sharing their research and what they've been working on with the larger GPODS community and everybody who has joined us. The format that we are following today is we are just sticking with 5 slides, maximum of 3 points on the slides, and 10 minutes per presenter, and then 5 minutes for Q&A. I also see Mr. Suresh Kumar, who's one of our eminent mentors and advisor at Global Policy Insights in the room as well. Thank you so much, sir, for joining us. This is very encouraging for our fellows when they are presenting. Uh, so without further ado, I am going to now invite Ashi Gupta, who's a policy enthusiast with a keen eye on international relations. Her research paper, namely Agricultural Investment Schemes in reference to Raitu Bandhu scheme, has been published in the Journal of the Asian Man. She's a level 3 certified Mandarin and level 2 certified Spanish language student. Ashi, over to you. Please let us know what you are going to be presenting on, and go ahead.
Uh, Thank you, Arpit, for that introduction. I hope everybody can see my screen. Yeah, okay, great. Second. Yeah. So I'll be speaking on the sustainable tourism in the state of Uttarakhand. Yeah. So the first thing that we need to ask is, why is there a need for sustainable tourism in Uttarakhand at all? The answer lies in the picture at your screens. Uttarakhand is a Himalayan range state of India, and which is witnessing excessive tourism, which leads to surplus carrying capacity with increased pressure on this terranean landscape. The glaciers are melting at fast pace. Increasing trends has been witnessed in earthquakes, excessive rainfalls, landslides, flash floods, cloud bursts, etc. Apart from environmental degradation, there has also been a loss of flora and fauna, overcrowding, disruption of local life, harming of historical sites, and the like. So tourism in this respect is going beyond its limits through excessive construction activities and water pollution leading to drying up of rivers. And even in these drying flat beds, communities are again constructing infrastructure. Frequent helicopter rides to and from the pilgrimage sites in area contribute to black carbon, which in turn accelerates the recession of glaciers. So, thus, over tourism in this area becomes an imperative concept in recent times, since excessive number of visitors negatively impact not only environment but also the culture and quality of life of the local residents. Tourism in the state. So this is the data which I found from the state tourism department of the state of Uttarakhand, and this data in front of you presents the number of tourists per year in the state. Even after the catastrophe of 2013 Kedarnath slash Uttarakhand disaster, there has been a steady increase in the tourism from 21 million tourists annually in 2013 to 39 million tourists in 2019. So why is there a steady increase? Because according to World Bank data, there has been a loss of the destruction loss of the state, the loss that state occurred, more than 3.8 billion US dollars, and more, and which is more than the state's budget for that financial year. So if Kedarnath Yatra were not restarted, the state have incurred further losses of up to $2.5 billion per year. So in this respect, there was an urgent need to restart the pilgrimage, and wherein the private players were also incentivized to increase the tourism in the state. Post 2019, the declining trend in the tourism was witnessed due to COVID. But in terms of percentage growth, there has been an exponential growth of 154% in tourism from 2020 to 2021. This is also called revenge tourism. This is an indication of human made climate change triggered by unplanned, unchecked development projects and unregulated tourism. So, this is a problem of concern over here. Next is the state tourism policies. So far the state tourism policies have been derived by the like made by the government since 2000. These are the two latest policies that I try to compare and analyze. So in terms of vision, they are quite similar as they both tend to create Uttarakhand as a global tourist destination, which is safe and which could include world-class tourism products and services. But there are differences that can be seen in these two policies. First, the 2018 policy is more investment friendly, and due to the national policy of ease of doing business, it's more focused on the investors, and which could benefit from capital subsets, from interest subsidies and stamp duty concessions and much more. While the 2023 state tourism policy uh, is more environmental sensitive, uh, it also endeavors to create a confident and conducive environment which is safer and mutually rewarding for tourists, for businesses, and other stakeholders. And it doesn't come at the cost of disturbing and depleting the ecological wealth of the state. Secondly, the objectives of these two policies. The objective of 2018 policy was to promote and develop the state as tourists hub, where their focus was on enhancing the state as medical tourist in medical tourism, in alpine tourism or winter tourism, in wellness packages and the Char Dham Yatras. But this wasn't seen in 2023 policy because it was most focused on information dissemination for tourists for before, during, and after their visits. It also focused on digitalization, wherein they focused on online bookings, and secondly, to create a digital database for accurate tourist behavior statistics. Thirdly, the major focus of 2018 policy was to establish a committee which is known as high powered empowered committee, which would include secretary of the state and secretaries of other departments such as tourism, industries, finance, revenue, urban development department, and finance controller. There was no such mention of this committee in 2023 policy, and this committee would implement the state policies through branding, through marketing, through your skill and capacity building. Uh, but even after reading these two policies, I feel that the state has failed to integrate the local government participation and community-led development to implement sustainable tourism policies. Also, the state have talked about creating 13 new district tourist destinations in 13 different districts of the state, which is still an ambitious policy and which is far from what it's being achieved. We are still far from what's been achieved because tourists are still attracted towards the Char Dham Yatra. Yeah, so hurdles and the way forward. So there are some hurdles that I found while I was researching, even though my research has been is based on secondary sources, but still there are some hurdles that I encountered in this process. One of which is the lack of information, which I did not receive from the government sources. The government in general have not published any data on the state of natural disasters occurred in the state. The website of State Disaster Management Authority mainly defines the natural disasters, like what is earthquake, what is landslides, rather than giving us the data uh, district wise, that how many landslides, how many earthquakes are being there annually, so that there can be a comparative analysis of the climate change in the state. And even the carrying capacity assessment hasn't been made by the state yet. Media houses have mentioned the interpretive loss of life, and the actual numbers are still unknown in the Kedarnath incident, and no one knows the actual. So the way forward, these are probable things that I could think of is one the citizen engagement. So one of the great examples of citizen participation is community-based tourism. This has already been there in the state. Uh, this is called Mountain Shepherds at Nanda Devi National Park, which combined environmental conservation with sustainable livelihoods. It chose to become a private company in 2011, in which they have hosted over 100 guests with a revenue of 27 lakh and with 40% profit margin. So this is one of the great examples that we can work on. Secondly, it is important to have behavioral change through historical revisionism. uh, Behavioral change amongst the people, rather than just being dependent on the government to implement the policy and other policy stages. So hence, historical revisionism becomes imperative. People should re-look over their spiritual texts. According to Hindu scriptures, all lives have the same right to existence. Human beings have no dominion over the other creatures. Similarly, in Buddhism, there is a concept of non-violence and ahimsa, and they also talk about the sustainability, and that humans shouldn't uh, over exploit the natural resources. Thirdly, looking for examples such as Vienna. So Vienna is one of the top 5 countries which is practicing sustainable tourism all around the world. They have basically 3 visions which they work. First is the vision of technology, wherein boutique hotel Stand Hill is the world's first hotel with zero energy balance, which means that within a year it generates as much energy via groundwater heat pump, photovoltaic technology, and solar panel as it consumes. They also offer their guests green bonus to encourage them to travel with reduced CO2 means of like carbon means of transportation. Secondly, the vision of regionality, wherein they are trying to promote their local traditions and also promoting regional handicrafts. And third, the vision of environmentally conscious host, wherein the enthusiastic rangers, hiking guides, wildlife watchers introduce their guests to natural surroundings and the seasonal cuisine. Fourth, the role of technology and artificial intelligence. Apart from personalized customer experience, the rise of artificial intelligence, augmented reality, virtual reality technologies can help prevent damage to cultural heritage sites by providing virtual experiences. AI with data mining can predict tourist flow and assist in recognizing and to aid in cultural heritage preservation. In similar vein, drones may be used to provide live virtual tours of open spaces, tourist location, a concept that would be a economical friendly innovation. And lastly, the policy stages that every policy student talks about is transparency, implementation, and feedback mechanisms. The government mainly needs to open up its sheets and present data to its citizens, which will enable accountability as well. Rather than incentivizing private players on the basis of investments they are making, they should incentivize them based on the carbon footprint that a particular private player is making. And important feedback mechanism, including all stakeholders such as indigenous communities, enterprises, civil society organizations, environmentalists must be considered at least on year basis. Thank you all, and now I'm open to questions.
Thank you so much, Ashi. Very interesting presentation. I will have a few questions, but if anybody else has, please go ahead first. Okay, then I am going to jump in with my questions to you, Ashi, which is that number one, I am thinking that why do you think local participation in Uttarakhand is lacking, and why do you think it's important?
Because Arpit, there are so many indigenous communities in Uttarakhand. There are so many tribes which are there living in forest, and with the Forest Act of the central government, too, these communities are being neglected. And when there is creation of infrastructure in major districts of Uttarakhand, which is like Chamoli and Uttarkashi, which focuses on Chardham Yatras and other states, then these then the land and the forest has also been, deconstructed. If we
So they
have
are
this,
facing the consequences of
yes,
this
exactly, yes,
unsustainable
exactly.
tourism.
Yes, and even right now I'm in Haridwar, and there is Rajaji National Park, which is like 10 minutes away from my house. And you won't believe that how that national park has been shrinking. And I have recently started coming to Haridwar, but my parents, they used to come since
Sure,
2000, and now it's their personal experience that how the forest has been, deforested, and so many industries have come up in Haridwar. So even the people can say that it used to be a jungle. There was so much forest, and like, I mean, it's coming to the ground reality that people can see these things, not just read about them. So I think it's very important to consider
sure.
this.
Uh, Now my next question is that uh, you know, you rightly pointed out there's no data on district-wise data on natural disasters over there. Who do you think would be most incentivized to publish that data? Because I can understand the government may not be doing it because if they publish the data, then it might negatively impact the investments that they could attract in the state, etc., etc.
Yeah.
Which makes me think a think tank should do it, but why should a think tank invest so much? Which makes me think that some private sector agency which has a lot of stakes in the state might want to do that. So that's what my thought is, but curious to hear yours.
Actually, even I had this question that why will they provide data as such? But even, there are some data that I found which was not by government, and which was not any private players, but they were by independent media houses.
Sure.
Yeah, so they were
But is that district level?
no, it's not a district level, but they presented like how many landslides are there annually in the last 2 to 3 years. That's it. So if you will go to the State Disaster Management Authority's website, I mean, the last cited source is 2005, and I was shocked to see it because straight away from 2005, they were just posting guidelines for COVID-19. So there is a like vast information gap, and I've been in talks with the tourism department. Probably next week, I'll be able to conduct an interview with the joint secretary of the tourism department. So I would like to raise this question in front of him, like why the data is not there. At least, like even in NDMA, like the National Disaster Management Authority, they provide some data, but for the state, I don't think so, because they think that who is going to visit our website? I mean, apart from a researcher or so, yeah, I think there's a problem there.
Yeah, I mean, my suspicion would be, and I could be wrong, and we have Mr. Suresh Kumar here, who's a seasoned bureaucrat, not from Uttarakhand state, but my understanding would be that the reasons could be political, or the reasons could be that there's no strong mandate that has come to that department to publish that data, and also perhaps the fact that that data is not welcome anyway. So. That would be my thing, and I would probably also think about whether the courts can direct the government to publish that data if you were to uh, you know uh, ascribe the presence of that data to some sort of fundamental human rights, etc. I'm sure that the courts might intervene, but yeah, that's all for me. Mr. Kumar.
Yeah, can I say something?
Sure, sir.
Thank you, Ashi. It was a nice presentation. And though I quite didn't understand your word you have used is historic revisionism. I don't
Yes.
know what is historic revisionism. How do you use that? Explain that. But this question on data is very relevant. Invariably in government, data on crisis and problems and issues like this is very sparingly, very rarely shared with the public or put in public domain for the common information, for the common knowledge. As a civil servant, whether it is starting in the lowest level to highest level, there has always been a hesitation to share data unless so mandated by any law, any orders of the court. since there was a serious crisis in Kedarnath and Uttarakhand, and there was a disaster, and I'm sure the NDMA and the National Disaster Management Authorities and other people would have collected data, would have information, but just to avoid any public panic and just information which creates and unnecessarily, stresses common man. So these data are not shared. But sure, if the data is required in policy formulation, in framing any schemes and program, in redeveloping the area, which are the areas which were badly affected with the disasters, what are the implications of the disasters. This is a public data, and sharing of that data should not be a problem. It would require little more effort and bureaucratic procedures. And I don't think the government of Uttarakhand should, or the NDMA or the State Disaster Management Authority should hesitate to data for better planning, for better policy making, for better development. But unnecessary sharing the data, putting in public domain to create public crisis and public hesitation, as it is, you've seen the post Kedarnath disaster, the tourist influx had gone down, and the economy of Uttarakhand was badly affected. So right now, I'm sure my colleague who's the chief secretary, he happens to be a Punjabi there, Sukhbir is there, Sukhbir Singh Sandhu. And he's a good officer, but he's trying to kind of revive the tourism and get the state back to normal. They are still not normal. Their tourist inflow is still not back to as normal as it should be. So that's
not pre-COVID levels still. Not pre-COVID levels still, sir.
Not the pre-disaster level.
Not the pre-disaster level. Yes.
See, in the Uttarakhand, when we see compare it, I don't think they've got back to pre-COVID. Implications are clearly known, and COVID has gone, and people have forgotten.
Yes.
Pre-COVID level, I think we are fully recovered.
They must have.
But wherever we've had the natural disasters and disasters of the scale, that time, in that year, which Ashi was talking about, Uttarakhand, this year we've had it in in the neighborhood Himalayan state of Himachal Pradesh. These kind of disasters cause long-term damage, and the people in the hills who live there permanently get panic. So it is a responsibility of the administration there to see that the people unnecessarily don't panic. If they're panicking, they need to be moved to the safer places, or if their houses that the rocks are slipping away, they are sinking. What kind of a strategy and what kind of a technology can help them to restore or secure their living and houses and their infrastructure? So that effort is still going on in Uttarakhand. There is quite a bit of hesitation from outsiders, particularly you see the outsiders from the neighborhood. Now from Uttar Pradesh, Punjab and Haryana are still visiting. But a lot of tourists used to go from Bengal and South India. Those tourists are still not visiting Uttarakhand and now Himachal. And Himachal has seen, this year, Himachal has seen quite a bit of devastation because of natural calamities. So that may be the reason, but data can be used for policy and programs. That's not an issue.
And so with the historical revisionism, it's an idea if the government is promoting Char Dham Yatra, which is a pilgrimage, and whether we see the Kawad Yatra in Haridwar, so it's an idea why we can't have that emotional connect with the environment, wherein it's already been there in our Hindu scriptures, and not just Hindu but also Buddhism scriptures and other religions. So why not have an emotional connect with the environment? Because when I was going through some media reports, people in Kedarnath has now believed the fact that ki bhai Kudrat apna कहर दिखा रही. It's the nature which is replying us back of the actions that we are doing. So I think with that thing, we can, have a behavioral change of mindset among the tourists or people themselves. Not because local communities are being there, and it's been generations that they're practicing those local cultures and traditions, and they are the most who are being affected by climate change and other degradation. So it's just a thought that why don't we revive?
Ashi, 2 points there. See, in any effort to improve sustainability or keep the focus on sustainability or achieve sustainability of any effort, any program, any scheme, one, you need to connect with your heritage. You see, unfortunately, we've been ignoring our heritage in development, particularly in agriculture and urban development. Now, that urban development includes what you said is industrial establishments and industrial development. These two things have been kind of getting totally disconnected with our heritage. As a result, sustainability becomes a suspect. Second thing is use of history in policy. History gives you a lot of inputs in policy making. Unfortunately, the present day generation, I don't belong to present day generation. I'm quite outdated now. But the present day generation believes that use of history means, no innovation, following the precedents, makhi pe makhi marna, and why should we follow the past? Past although has some historical wisdom.
Yep.
So you can build upon that historical wisdom. You cannot ignore the historical wisdom. So the use of history in policy making to improve sustainability of any effort, any scheme, any initiative is very important. And that is what, if you meant by that, I think that's the right way to go about it.
Yes.
Sir, I think that is a really, really interesting point, and that might make for a good joint article that we can author, because use of history in policy is something that I'm also very passionate about, and I would definitely want to.
Arpit, I already have a draft article, use of history in policy making. I can send it to you. Of course, I write opinion pieces, but I can send it to you.
Yes, but we would love to read it and circulate
I'll mail
it
it.
around.
I'll mail it to you. I'll mail it both. I'll mail it to balancing heritage for sustainable development and use of history in policy making. These two articles, the first drafts, but they are still there with me. In fact, I've sent
That
to
would be very interesting.
my colleague in Cambridge in Department of Archaeology. I've sent it to Cameron. I'm still waiting for his inputs.
Okay.
But I'll send it to you if you read it, and then if you want to improve it, and then yes, we can surely publish it as joint articles.
Certainly, sir. Certainly.
I'll
Thank you.
I'll mail it to you tomorrow.
Thank you, sir. Now, moving over to our next speaker for today, Tristan Norman. Tristan is a programs officer at the Young Professionals in Foreign Policy, Tokyo, and a graduate of Hendrix College with a major in social entrepreneurship and innovation. Tristan, over to you.
And a good question. He raises good questions.
Absolutely.
Yeah, he was there in last
yes.
Oh, yes. Well, thank you all so much for coming today. I'm going to go in a little bit of a different field that I've been doing research on this past summer, which is sort of linking together global risk and how we understand risk blindness. So I like to preface this because the sensitivity of this topic, that the views expressed in this are mine alone. They do not represent the views of GPODS or Young Professionals in Foreign Policy Tokyo. So this is my personal research, and I will continue on with that. So this research for today that I've been working on a little bit with the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons, as well as the International Physicians for the Prevention of Nuclear War. We've been working a little bit on this over the summer, sort of exploring the connections between the climate to nuclear nexus, the climate crisis, nuclear weapons, and global risk. So a little bit of a
Tristan,
preface.
we can't see the screen.
Really?
Yeah, it just shows loading. Yeah.
Give me one moment.
Sure.
How about now?
Oh, yes. Now we can.
Okay. Perfect. So to preface this a little bit, we are looking at, the nuclear question today. So if we're looking at international peace and security, we are seeing increasingly since the Russia-Ukraine crisis that international peace and security has been fractured. This is characterized by low levels of trust between countries, very high stakes in how countries think of their own legitimacy and their own risk and security considerations, as well as a weakening of norms. At the same time, we're seeing a rise that nuclear weapons are back on the table for being a tool for geopolitical gain. We can see that in how Putin is using nuclear weapons on the table to press certain political and military gains in Ukraine. And in tandem with this, we are also seeing the rise and modernization of global nuclear weapon stockpiles. And increasingly, these are not the nuclear weapons of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. These are nuclear weapons that have been severely modernized and are increasingly more deadly in potential, 10 to 50 times more powerful. So if you're looking at this screen here, you're seeing this is the total number of global nuclear warheads and inventories around the world. As you can see, most of it is concentrated in Russia, United States, but you're also seeing this growth in other nuclear weapon states over the next 2 years. And between now and 2030, this is expected to rise and to be increased in efficiency and in damage. And so this is not no longer the Cold War, but in fact, an even more fractured and uncertain time characterized with ambiguity. In fact, the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists stated that we're closest to nuclear Armageddon than we have ever been. And this is because of the intersection of these global risks that were once siloed that are slowly converging together. So, for preface this, limited nuclear war is no longer limited. So, size matters not. So, because of the increase in innovation in nuclear weapons technology, even a limited nuclear conflict between non-traditional powers, let's say Russia and United States, would not be would have catastrophic consequences. And so if we are looking, the recent study by the IPPNW stated that if in the event of a regional nuclear war between these countries, the catastrophic impact on the climate and global food security would be quite severe. And so even with a limited nuclear conflict using 3% of nuclear weapons, we would see a drastic global cooling that would decrease global food security and have wrap-on effects around the world. Now, they sort of characterize this as transboundary nuclear famine. So if we look at a regional conflict between nuclear weapon states, they have estimated that it will lead to immediately 27,000 deaths. So, but whenever a nuclear weapon is detonated, the firestorms that cause from that blast raise soot into the atmosphere and lead to a global cooling effect. And so this is measured in teragrams of soot, which would lead to a rapid 2 to 5 degrees Celsius cooling within 5 years, as well as a 7 to 50% decrease in food production. So rather than the immediate effect, the long-term impact would lead to global disruption of global food systems and supplies. And so, case in point, this would be from a limited one with between a regional nuclear conflict. And so one thing is that geography does not impact this. This could be in a regional conflict in this area, but could also lead to lock-on effects in other parts of the world. So if this was in a full-blown crisis between Russia and Ukraine, you would see a more drastic effect of 360 million people being killed in the first exchange, as well as a global food system collapse and reduction in 90% of food and 5 billion in starvation within 5 to 10 years. So pretty drastic circumstances. And one thing that we're also seeing in tandem with this is that the risk landscape of today is changing, and it's due to the climate crisis. So the climate crisis is a threat multiplier and adds different stresses and risks to emerging and existing conflicts. And so as we're seeing the climate crisis accelerate, we're also seeing competition over resources and natural resource scarcity beginning to come into play, whether it's, you can think of like fresh water access as being one of these critical areas. Now, governments are slowly waking up to the reality of climate security and its impacts on the national security, but are they doing enough, and are they doing enough quickly? So the United States and NATO have just begun enacting climate security policies, but this is not uniform across all nuclear weapon states. China and India, to my knowledge, have not done so in a uniform fashion. And so if we were looking at this climate security threshold, this is what you would see in the near term, 1 to 2 degrees Celsius warming. Now, if we fast forward this, you will see in the medium to long term, which we're on trajectory for, is 2 to 4 degrees Celsius warming. And as you see, the catastrophic impact of climate change in these areas is pretty severe, which is seen in purple. Now, this is all across the board. It's not limited to one particular area or region. And so, but the crux is that climate security is becoming a security problem. It's no longer an economic or development challenge. Yet, the UN Security Council and P5 members are not taking that as seriously as they should. And in fact, they're not putting it on the table for topic to be consideration for international public peace and security. And so if you look at this table, this map here, you will see the countries that voted against bringing this to the United Nations Security Council and voted against this resolution as a priority for member states. And so climate you can connect is like, why should we connect it? Well, we're seeing an increase in a volatile international security environment impacted by many non-traditional security risks and stressors. So we need to start thinking outside of our traditional security considerations, considering what things are impacting our security decision-making and what risks we allowed in our decision-making processes. And so we have nuclear weapons in one area, we have the climate crisis in another, and we have two pathways for this. Either we ignore the connections between climate change and the nuclear question and how that impacts our own security considerations, and we lead to potential catastrophic failure. Or we do so early, linking together two traditionally siloed areas, seeing where the risks converge and taking a critical examination of how much risk we will tolerate. And we might be able to avert a worse outcome. Now, that's not to say that climate change leads to nuclear war, but that climate change creates the ambiguity and the complexity enough to where we could run into serious challenges either between how countries are making decisions or the integrity of nuclear weapons facilities due to climate change impacts, which is a really critical area. But if you're not looking for that risk, you're not planning for that risk. And so essentially the global threat landscape is changing, and we need to really start de-siloing these risk areas. And so here you see on the screen is the World Economic Global Risk Report from 2023, where they see the interconnection of these global risks and how they intersect with each other. Now, right here in the very small little orange one, you see the use of weapons of mass destruction as a very small risk indicator. But that would show that it is in some ways still connected to this larger global trend of failure to properly address the climate change crisis and how that will affect everyone. And so whenever we're thinking of these interconnections between climate and nuclear security, we have to acknowledge the fact that the end game is the same. Either we get hold of the climate crisis and we're able to save the planet and increase peace and security around the world, or we don't, and we go down the path of nuclear Armageddon, in which the climate is also severely disrupted and global food security collapses. And so we have three critical options. One is you follow the science, you increase public awareness of nuclear security risk, and in tandem with climate awareness, and really stress the cost of inaction and communicate that to member states and governments, as sort of these international nuclear disarmament campaigns have done. You go the governmental route where you start de-siloing these non-traditional security risks like climate change, and you take into national and regional security risk and threat analysis, and this goes across the board, particularly for nuclear weapon states that have the most say in how these nuclear weapons will be used. In addition, people should conduct climate change vulnerability assessments of all nuclear installations and facilities, as well as command and control operations. Now, this is really critical because you're already seeing this emerge within nuclear energy, is that the climate change impacts on these facilities could be quite dire. We need to have that same level of interest for nuclear weapons facilities, because that creates a lot of risk and natural disaster risks that could be catastrophic. And lastly, on the multilateral concept, there has to be a greater acknowledgement of the impact of climate security risk on international peace and security. The natural first step would be bringing this back to the UN Security Council to discuss this and to see the more long-term impacts in a warming planet and how that changes traditional security scenarios at a time whenever multilateralism might be more fragmented because of these global risks in the future. And then lastly, of course, supporting the nuclear non-proliferation movement is critical, because if you have more nuclear weapons in a more climate unstable world, you have more chances of risk and less oversight. And at the end of the day, the goal of this should be to have control over how we use nuclear weapons and leading to eventual commitment to the global nuclear disarmament architecture. Now, there is precedent for this. Nuclear winter theory and modeling has been around since the 1980s and 90s. This was a critical moment in which Gorbachev and Reagan brought together US and Russian climate scientists to see the global impact of nuclear weapons, and that led to eventual de-escalation of conflicts and progression to nuclear disarmament and control. We need to have that same level of commitment now, at a time whenever we are having this fragmentation in international norms, as well as a global emerging climate crisis, because that's just the most risk-friendly thing to do. And to put these in two silos is to bring too much risk upon our systems. And so we should ask what level of preparedness we have. Climate change has impacted our socio-political and economic systems. Can we really say that they will not impact our nuclear security systems? I think not. Thank you, and I'll take some time for questions.
Thank you, Tristan. If there are any questions, can go ahead first, and I'll ask mine after that.
Thank you.
Okay.
It's a really big emerging topic, and I've just started the research on that.
So, Tristan,
my
my comments as follows. First of all, very interesting presentation, and I've been a student of systems thinking, and I'm always fascinated by how two seemingly unrelated issues to the public mind can actually be related. I am really, really interested in this network map that you've shared over here. And I mean, from my policy making approach, and everybody has their own brand of policy making approach, the way that I would do it is that little dot of nuclear risk, to de-risk that, my adaptation mechanism would be, of course, mitigation mechanisms. Nuclear specialists are the best folks who would do it. My adaptation mechanism would be that I can see that there are three things connected to that particular dot: state collapse, terrorist attacks, interstate conflicts. These are the immediate, first order layers of effect if, weapons of mass destruction, as far as those are concerned. I would try to address these three factors, and secure them to the extent that even if that central dot collapses, the knock-on effects are minimal over there. So the ripples just go lighter and lighter as they connect with other issues. That's what I would do. So yeah, but very interesting.
Thank you. And I think, like, particularly whenever we think of state collapse, we can literally think of North Korea, for example, a state we know very little about, but has very high level of climate vulnerability. And we don't have the knowledge of the security of these nuclear weapons facilities or how that will affect decision making. Let's say you have a period of really rapid climate disasters that lead to state or social disorder. And that could affect decision making in really dire ways.
No, absolutely, absolutely. And I also think, do you want to just touch upon, the de-siloed approach, and what would it take to sort of convince various governments right now, as you already pointed out, that the level of trust and the trust in norms is the weakest over the past few decades? Then how do you propose a de-siloing over just normatively saying that this is what it should be done, but how do you propose it can be done?
That's a very critical question, and something I've been thinking about a little bit lately. On the multilateral level, it would be a little bit challenging because, I mean, there is a mechanism for it, but it kind of leads towards nuclear disarmament, the Treaty on Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, but most nuclear weapon states don't want to sign on to this. So I think one thing you would have to consider is like seeing the benefits of taking this de-siloed approach to their own risk reduction, their own calculations of how they see emerging threats. I think that's really critical, and you start that as a national process. And it might be useful to start it first by looking at climate security and then seeing where climate change manifests in different parts of their systems, or their security systems. And chances are it will eventually lead to the nuclear question, which is kind of like the hardball one that nobody really wants to talk about. And so I think starting that at the national level and then bringing that to international forums like the Security Council would be a good start, or even having some oversights with the International Atomic Energy Association agency.
I was just about to say that.
They could look at the risk of nuclear terrorism or the integrity of these facilities. But the critical thing is that the IEA, the international, has to be invited to these countries in order to be able to look at their facilities. You know, it'll be hard ask for them to say, hey, you can look at our nuclear energy plants, sure, But looking at our nuclear weapons facilities is a whole nother ballgame. And so it would really depend upon how strong the global nuclear order is in this time of fragmentation. There's a great agreement and oversight on this, then that's a pathway for that. If there's not, then it's a recipe for a lot of challenges into like bringing that label.
I mean,
But
the
I
good
think,
thing.
yeah.
Sorry, go ahead, Tristan.
Oh no, I think maybe the easier way would be starting with climate and then seeing how climate security interacts with all of these risks, and then bringing the nuclear question into that at the appropriate time.
Absolutely. And I also think that, the IAEA would be a great agency for this. I agree with you over there because they also have sufficient research on climate. And, they've got some great people working on that. And I would, if I were IAEA, I would probably share the same knowledge with North Korea and, some of these more closed off states. Regardless of whether they show their facilities to us or not, just as best practices to safeguard their infrastructure, and hope that they would use it. So I would not make that knowledge transfer conditional on whether they show us the facilities or not, and just convey to them that these are the risks and this is how you mitigate them. Then it's up to you. So very interesting, Tristan. Thank you so much. There are no other questions. I'm going to invite our next speaker, Mr. James Peak, who's a strategic leader in business technology with a background in strategic leadership and operational excellence. He is keen on leveraging the transformative power of technology across diverse business functions. James, over to you.
All right. Well, how do I share the screen?
Oh, you just you'd be seeing a green button called share screen at the bottom of your. Yeah.
You can see, so everyone can see it. Okay.
Yes.
Wait a second. All right. So, hello, I'm James. I'm actually going to present on the project I've been working on from the organization called the Student Energy. I'm currently a fellow, part of the program for the fellowship program that I'm participating. And I've been doing research for at least 10 months onto how we can make improvements to the Inflation Reduction Act to ensure that we have a sustainable future to benefit everyone for the cost analysis, how the law itself, the legislation, how it actually could be able to better improve on the lives of people to access the legislation on this funding for the green energy and climate fund that they were trying to enable to bring it to the people. Firstly, I'm not sure if everyone heard about the Inflation Reduction Act, but probably you may heard it or not. But the Inflation Reduction Act, which I obviously, the day when it first got signed by President Joe Biden at the time last year, it was one of the significant largest budget legislation that was passed during his administration, of course, than any other president. I'm not sure if that's accurate or not, but about at least $370 billion were actually been allocated to the funds to green energy sectors and a lot of things that you've been heard of for the past few years during the pandemic and everything that has been heard. The goal for this, the background, the framework of this legislation was to trying to reduce the U.S. greenhouse gas emission by 40% by 2030. Now, I'm kind of skeptical about this, whether this can be met or not, depending on the individual and other stakeholders, whether they're going to buy into this or not, because there has been some pushback among the individuals like myself, where basically I'm not saying it goes against this law, but is the funding are actually going towards the people who actually desperately need it? Like if it was saying basically paying up front on the green energy tax credits, whether basically I would say, okay, I have to buy this, I don't know, electrical vehicle, which is like, I don't know, say if it was $20,000 or $30,000, which is really expensive right now if you buy it in cash or pay up front. But if you obviously take some of the tax credit, the question is, okay, even though I have to pay it down on the tax credit, does that obviously pay it off? Or does it obviously fit my needs to do on my daily basis to trying to fit the needs for the climate energy that I'm trying to meet that? So there has been a lot of questions regarding to that. So pretty much all they're trying to do of this law was to make sure that they're focusing on the wind, solar, clean energy environment that they're trying to push for, that Joe Biden, other his political parties have been pushing for many years, trying to get the United States to be inching towards the global clean energy country. So pretty much how this is going to allocate what's in the law itself, well, pretty much I don't have the time to explain the full details, but what I could tell you is that everything from clean energy to clean biotechnology, manufacturing, all of this basically are trying to make sure that we have a clean energy environment to incentivize people to say, hey, obviously transition yourself from gas powered vehicles to the clean energy environment, which, okay, that can be obviously a solution. It's a good solution, but how much of about that impact or that incentive is going to be going towards those people who are disincentivized? So meaning that for those who cannot afford it, because even though you have the energy tax credit yourself, it's still not going to pay up entirely for the vehicle itself. Or say you have a gas furnace in your basement or whatever it is, and basically you're trying to convert that to a electrical heat thermometer or whatever it is. So I think there is a lot of questions regarding to this, the legislation itself. That's why for like the last 10 months, I've been trying to do a lot of research. Okay, so when President Biden himself passed this law, now the real question is, okay, where are the monies going? That is the biggest question that we as citizens always like to ask, because if we think about it deeply, okay, every single time when a politician or the president go up to their podium and they say, hey, obviously we passed this biggest legislation. Okay, fine. Where's the money going? Okay, they're not being transparent about that. That's where my solution has been going on for several months right now, to trying to figure out where we could ensure that where the tax credit is money going to, and where we can ensure that these monies are going directly to the right people. Because if we're keep saying obviously these are benefiting people, then how we can ensure that we could make it transparent, which they have not yet right now, even though they kept saying that, okay, 1 year, it's been 1 year right now after this legislation been passed. Okay, everything's been money spread to manufacturing, private sector businesses, and everything's already spurring on there. But is it benefiting towards the workers or the people who are obviously trying to, I don't know, transition into clean energy, or obviously trying to get the jobs? But where's the education? Where's the local funding, where the local government has to come in and say that, okay, we have a transition program where you could take apprenticeship and a lot of those sort of things to trying to transition you out from the old education, or in this case, the previous education that you got from the past. So basically you're trying to transform it into a new education that you're trying to go into. In this case, you're trying to upgrade your skills to ensure that you are obviously up to date to the current industry right now. So I would say that in order to resolve all of this, all the skepticism is basically using the blockchain. And so what a blockchain is basically, you just think of it as this accounting ledger. Basically, it has all the steps where, okay, it tells you where's the money going and everything, all of that. That's pretty much what the blockchain is. And it actually would actually prevent from misusing the funds, where the private sector would say, okay, this is the money you spend, but how do you know if they're spending the right way or not? We don't know. And that's why, obviously, I think that's why blockchain can be the opportunity to ensure that we could make sure that the money's appropriated correctly, but also prevent the misuse of those funds, where the companies would say, okay, obviously, I have some of the money here for you, but at the same time, how do you know if they're spending the right way? They could be, obviously, everything closed doors and may misappropriate to the wrong person. There could be a corruption involved. We don't know, but that can be the case. There have been some reports regarding to that some companies are trying to fudging up the numbers to try to benefit for their own goods in this case the company itself. So overall, I think that's one of the solutions I've been proposing, but I do know that at the same time, it's not going to be 100% perfect, because it's not going to be. Now, how are we going to be ensured that we could make sure that it's all fit into it, is to make sure it's not only transparency, but also to make sure that we have a digital records, and to make sure that we have a platform that we can ensure that everything is all tracked and monitored, to ensure that we go through that process and have the internal auditors, in this case, not from the company, but probably from external, if it was like experts from, well, I say from someone who's obviously a consultant firm, or obviously someone who's obviously expert in accounting or auditing. They could come in and obviously do an independent audit investigation, whether these are obviously going to the right people, in this case, the stakeholders to sell. So that's what the passport, and ensuring that all of this goes on to it, to make sure that everything goes along to promote that. And I think another thing that can be beneficial with this blockchain is to not only promote the sustainability, in this case, we're trying to reduce the paper waste and all of that stuff, but it is to ensure that we have a regulatory compliance in place. So depending on the individual, or in this case, the company itself, depending on stakeholders, it depends how many times they could do a compliance. For me, if I was their advisor, or in this case, their policy recommender, I would recommend doing like once in every month or once every 2 months, because then ensure that we keep in check to make sure that those businesses are in compliance, to make sure that the funds are going directly to the right people. And so I obviously came up with a lot of these policy recommendations to make improvements on the Inflation Reduction Act, because there are some of them have been missing from it. Like I was mentioning earlier, there needs to be a real-time audits, and there needs to be adoption onto this technology of blockchain, in order to ensure that we held accountable where these finances are going to the right people. Because if we're not, and if we automatically assume these funds are going to the right people, again, obviously, how do we know where the accuracy of where that funds could go to? Because I may never know if it's going to benefit or not, but we ensure that it benefits to all the stakeholders who are involved, and to make sure that they get the training, that the amount of time to get involved with it, to ensure that they know how to use this technology, and to ensure that they get the proper receiving of training and everything else associated with that. And I think the last thing, I forgot to mention this earlier, but regarding the blockchain, there is some concern about the data's privacy and security. There's definitely, it is. I'm not, again, like once the thing that I mentioned earlier, it goes back to what I was mentioning. It's not going to be 100%, but it should be serve as a mitigation and prevention methods to ensure that we protect the personal data, at the same time, the financial data, whoever the stakeholders involved with, whether that is businesses, technology, or in this case, the citizens, whoever obviously looking at the data, and basically ensure that we put in place the end-to-end encryption and other security measures to ensure that these are not leaked out of nowhere, or obviously got hit by a cyber attack from some foreign bad actors, because they want to steal those information and put it as a ransom for political or what various reasons. And I think that's why we need to have a lot of these campaign awarenesses, and need to advance the research and development. There are some research and development has been onto the law itself, but I think there needs to be continuation from research and development in order to ensure that how do we need to ensure that those advancements in blockchain can be approved over time through real time, in this case, what I was mentioning about, and not just like once in a year or just once in a lifetime, because again, technology keeps outpacing everything to the data that we obviously currently have. And that's where the critical part of it is. But obviously that would include my presentation. I mean, there's a lot of things I could share about, but I think that could be forwarded into the Q&A questions. But I do appreciate for all your time and everything regarding to my presentation and your time as well. I appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you so much, James. Great presentation. Just a couple of questions from my side. Number one is that, there's something I cover in my game theory lectures, is that how do you break out of the prisoner's dilemma and move from a non-cooperative equilibrium to a cooperative one? And the cooperative one I'm talking about, moving to, let's say, new energy forms, or, buying an electric vehicle. So let's say if that is cooperative, then how do you get everybody over there? One thing that you would need in order to calibrate the incentives is that how much incentive does a person on the street need exactly to make that decision to shift from a non EV to an EV? What is the exact amount? Because anything that the government is providing, if it is short of the exact amount, it's the whole money wasted. So you have to hit the exact amount or exceed it to be able to give people the incentive to switch from this equilibrium to another one. Anything short of that, it's a waste. So one is that, it would be nice to have data on that as to what those gaps are, which I'm sure is not the hardest thing, because the market prices of vehicles are available. People's preferences can be pulled in. So yeah, that's one. The other is, I like the idea where you're saying using blockchain for tracking budgets and flows of money in the government and public-private partnerships, etc. You also mentioned about the risks of moving to blockchain, and you mentioned cybersecurity architecture, etc., etc. Now, I would want to understand, I'm sure that policymakers would be most concerned about, what if we move to blockchain? What are some of the other risks that we are not seeing? That's number one. What are the cost and benefits of, if we compare risks of, let's say, current technology versus blockchain? What are the costs? And usually, I think it's not even about the benefits. The question always comes to cost. What are the costs that I'm willing to pay? What are the costs that I'm not willing to pay? So if, let's say, cybersecurity risks of blockchain can lead to national security risks or risks of authoritarianism, etc., those are not the costs that I want to pay, irrespective of whatever the benefits are. So I don't know if you've thought a lot about the first order, second order risks of moving to blockchain. I think once those have been allayed, then there could be a real conversation about moving towards blockchain. So those are just my comments. Yeah.
Yep. No, I do appreciate it for all your comments. I mean, again, I think, again, the one thing that frustrates me is right now, because it's in real time right now, because of this legislation that was passed last year. Again, after taking a look into research and a lot of this, there still hasn't been real actual data what's happening in the ground. They just basically bluntly say, okay, they obviously say, for example, I'm making this up, but from the last time I know, from the data after the 1 year when they did a research from various institutions that I look into, they said approximately maybe $320 billion worth, I don't know, sent to, like, say, let me use an example in my state, because this is where it gets a lot of money from. So in the state of Georgia, there has been a lot of foreign companies are starting to come over here because of that Inflation Reduction Act, and basically at least maybe, I don't know, $100 billion were poured into it. Okay, that's good. In the politician side, they're doing it for political reason because they're trying to increase the employment, all of that stuff. Okay, fine. But does it benefit to the individual? Which in this case, in my experience, obviously, let me go into further. The Korean companies already obviously have made a lot of tons of investment coming into here in Georgia. And okay, it has been beneficial, but the question is there has been a lot of discriminatory efforts within the labor issues going on in the manufacturing. That is obviously there has been a lot of labor tensions going on, but whether that obviously is, whether it's benefiting or not, that still obviously needs to take into research and may be going to other solutions or anything other than that. But I think that's why it's just really a huge amount of frustration that also we don't know the actual data of how much is this cost benefit analysis, how much is that benefiting towards the individual or other stakeholders, because it's still in real time. They always say, they bluntly say $320 billion to clean energy tax credit to individuals, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, that's too vague. We just don't have those clear ideas. So I'm not saying you're wrong. I think that is a concern. That's always a concern for me as well, because as an individual, as I'm the person who paying the taxpayer every single year. Okay, sometimes I do not like the idea of paying taxes still at this point, because the government eat away a lot of our budgets where, okay, if the law is an Inflation Reduction Act, okay, that is also kind of distorted at the same time because it's not intentionally trying to reduce it. But is it benefit to all the stakeholders to the point, is it benefiting that is going on the ground? That obviously I don't know, but it's still obviously a lot of research that has to be done to a lot of stakeholders for that.
Sure. No, absolutely, James. All interesting points. I'm going to invite Salim to ask his question or share his comments. Yes.
Yeah, thank you. So I mean, for me, it's just listening to, I hear Inflation Reduction Act, and at the back of my mind, it has to reduce inflation. And if you look at ideally, expansionary fiscal policy is inflationary, and I think he makes a good point in being able to trace out those budget lines and what's actually coming back in return, because you don't want a vaguely executed Inflation Reduction Act where you are obviously putting the money towards noble causes, but is the benefit from that extra budgetary fiscal expansion being paying back its dividends. So I really think it's a really good paper that you're working on. I would love to read a completed version of it just to concretize your thoughts.
Mm-hmm.
I wish I would, but obviously I'm not in school, but I don't have to be a researcher in school in order to do that. But I think another good point about the clawback protection, I think there has been a lot of tensions going on regarding to that as well, because I think the Commerce Secretary, Gina, which obviously in this case, they actually was, at the time when this law was gotten passed, there was a section of the part where it says EV tax credit and basically which companies are allowed to get it or not. And there has been some discriminatory efforts to trying to say, okay, they're trying to pick and choose which companies are doing. I think the fundamental of this law itself, it's not Inflation Reduction Act. First of all, it's a Clean Energy Act, I would say, for the tax credit. But the whole idea is for the Biden administration they're trying to go into is they're trying to put the United States into a global clean energy sector, or in this case, in the country itself, because currently right now they're trying to compete with China to go after them, because we were obviously losing the spot for tech reason, but also the clean energy itself. So they're trying to wrestle with this and trying to be urgent to trying to race to the top of it. Okay, that's the political part. But I think the second part is that obviously regarding to EV tax credit, that's where the South Korean manufacturers are going after the government and saying that, hey, obviously you discriminated us, because there was a section of part of the IRA saying you cannot if you cannot invest in the US or if you cannot manufacture in the US, you cannot get the EV tax credit at all. So it's like a Made in America global framework saying you have to invest in here, not elsewhere, which in this case, there were some South Korean companies at the time are obviously still in China manufacturing some of the battery parts and all of that stuff. But obviously there has been a hurdles regarding to that, and there has been some political tensions going on. And still, even today, they're still trying to figure out what the law of the intentions was actually meant to. And that, again, it goes back to what I was saying. This law is too broad and it's too vague to the point we, as ordinary Americans, know I have no idea about it. So I think it's a concept of the industrial policy that we saw in East Asia at the time, where obviously the government is obviously starting to intervene in specific industries because they're deeming for national security reason or for their economic reason, for their agenda, for political agenda, for whatever the reason that can be.
James, we are running a little short on time, so we are going to move to the next presenter if that's fine. But no, thank you. I think this is a fascinating topic, and I think this could actually be a good PhD topic for many of the researchers. So I would like to learn more about it. In the interest of time, I'm just going to move to the next speaker. Thank you. So our next speaker is Salim Ahmed Mapila. Salim is a development planner at the National Planning Commission of Malawi. He holds a rich technical background in medium to long-term development planning at the national and subnational level. Salim, over to you.
Thank you very much. So, I mean, from the background, yes, I work with the National Planning Commission of Malawi. And I think entities like the National Planning Commission have been a rising trend in most development countries in recent years. And this comes at the backdrop of, you have the Sustainable Development Goals. In Africa, we have Agenda 2063. And as a way of domesticating and, in a sense, I think having continuity in terms of development planning at national levels, these countries are beginning to have these national planning entities that would do away with political short-termism and pursue a development agenda that spans years, because that's the only way we're going to develop. And I think within that broader way of thinking, issues around what type of development priorities should we be pursuing, and from the SDGs and Agenda 2063, how can we tailor domesticate specific interventions given country context and thinking around that. So this project that we did, my Priorities project, has that spirit at the back of its conception. Ideally, it was a collaborative project that was being implemented by the National Planning Commission with technical support from a regional think tank called the African Institute for Development Policy and the Copenhagen Consensus Center, who are very big on economic evaluations, particularly cost-benefit analysis. They've done an interesting work on the Sustainable Development Goals halfway to completion. I don't know if you've heard about Bjorn Romborg, but he just published his book, The Best Things First, working with Bill Gates and them. He's coming to Malawi to do a launch next week. But that's the methodological thinking in terms of costs and benefits and how we prioritize our interventions in our national development plans. So the project that I managed in Malawi, and this project, I think replicas of it have been done in several countries, Ghana, Haiti, I think they're in Uganda now, and so forth. But in Malawi, we did it from March 2020 to December 2021. And essentially, we set it up, as I say, to identify and promote the most effective interventions that address, the country's development challenges and, seek to support the attainment of its development plans. Now, in Malawi, when you speak development plans, we have what we call a long-term development vision, which is called Malawi 2063. You can tell from the name it's pegged against Agenda 2063 being pursued by the African Union. But ironically, in 2063, Malawi would have cropped 100 years of self-rule. So beyond political independence, I think the vision espouses in a push for economic independence. Now, that's 4 decades from its inceptions. And, we kind of felt like we need to sequence our implementation efforts, and that is done through what we call MIPS. So we're implementing the first MIP 1, which spans for a 10-year span, and its implementation corresponds with the last decade of action of the SDGs, because we're also trying to implement those through that. The SEP is the socioeconomic recovery plan. Essentially, what I'm trying to say that the research outputs of this project informed the policy priorities that feature in these very key documents that really define Malawi's development direction for the next 4 decades. So as an explicit aim, the project sought to provide, government with a systematic process to help it prioritize the most effective policy solutions to maximize, the returns on the kwacha or the DORA investment that the country is making. And that's very apparent for a country like Malawi with a very limited fiscal space. Now, I just want to go a little bit into detail in terms of what the project looks like. And I think I'll flash through some of the results and, how we have carried it forward and how we've, pragmatically used it to inform, for evidence-informed decision making at a country level. Ideally, in its entirety, the project produced around 20 plus research papers, and the structuring of the project was in 2 components. We had the economic research component, but we didn't want to just end at evidence generation. We wanted to, push through the evidence value chain, and also placed a very strong emphasis on research uptake as a component of the project. And we try to split it into thematic areas from agriculture, natural resource management, focus on the social sectors and human capital development, an explicit focus on economic development and the governance theme thrown in there. As I said, and this is the strength of the Copenhagen Consensus Center, one of the implementing partners, the economic research was centered around cost-benefit analysis. So you're looking at a systematic correction and assessment of evidence, in a sense, to quantify, what it is that you're putting in and what is it that you get out of it. And in doing that, in choosing, what type of research questions we should be probing for consideration, the National Planning Commission has a research agenda that encapsulates what the vision document says. We had a few, reference group, academic advisory group, sector experts groups who really teased out the sector-specific recommendations we were given for quality control and just to fine-tune the process. And ideally, for each research piece, we'll come up with a technical report and a policy brief. But that technical report and policy brief had to find its way in the hands of the decision maker. So that's where the research update component really came in. And the dissemination platforms for this were usually policy dialogues that we held with different government ministries, departments, and agencies. Essentially, the relevant ministry department that was a direct beneficiary of the research, evidence was engaged, and we've had projects and government funded and development partner funded projects evolve out of those efforts in the Ministry of Education and etc. I mean, we also had like policy workshops, media panels. There's a lot of articles in print media. We made a lot of noise about it. I mean, all the major TV networks would be invited to a panel, would take the ministry heads themselves, give them the evidence in front of the country, allow for questions and say, hey, I mean, if you have this amount of money, you have this type of choices, put your money here and these are the returns that you get from the evidence. And, just put them on the spot and try to make them accountable to the nation, but in a sense, trying to get value for money that we really don't have as a country. And from the research uptake components, just to highlight a few, key products that came out of that. As I said, this process really informed the priority interventions that are being pursued by the country for the next 10 years. The priority interventions that were pursued as a response to COVID-19 for 3 years, and the national budgets, which are formulated on a yearly basis, really still draw from the evidence that was provided in terms of interfacing with the Minister of Finance and telling him, he does consultations and he comes and says, where should I put the money? This is how much I have in the sector. And the research evidence has been very beneficial in that front. Again, the debate, when the Minister of Finance develops the budget, he takes it to the National Assembly. The Parliamentary Budget Committee will probably read the deliberation around if they should approve the budget or not. So when we do a twofold dissemination effort where we speak to the Minister of Finance and then we speak to parliamentarians and kind of try to rally them around, going for the best development buys for the country. We have tried to do a little bit of capacity building around the project to just inculcate within, I think, the technocrats in government, an evidence-informed way of making decisions using cost-benefit analysis as a methodology. And if you're interested, if I spoke too fast through this presentation, what we did was we compiled all the findings of this research project into an editor-written book, which you could see on your screen. Myself, the Director General of the Commission, the Research Manager, a few colleagues from the Copenhagen Consensus Center, Professor Madise from the African Institute for Development Program, just collated all the research pieces by the participants into an editor-written book you could find online on the NPC website. That's some of the papers that we developed. So beyond the book, if you're interested in specific thematic areas and how we undertook the analysis and assumptions we're working with and how we quantified the costs and benefits for specific interventions, you could dig in and get a sense of that. I want to close this slide knowing my time is probably up. So this is all the benefit cost ratios that we came up with from the CPA, telling you, how we quantified and did a ratio of the benefits and the costs. You notice some of the biggest BCRs come out in the social sectors, education, education quality. Some very interesting, I think, reform has been done in terms of agriculture production and commercialization as part of the vision, which has a focus area on land titling. And there's legislation that has been done around that, part of it informed by the findings of this research project. So out of a temptation to continue speaking, I think I will say more on it as a prompt to the Q&A section that follows. Otherwise, I thank you for your attention, and I hope this is a crash course in getting you interested and looking at how we're prioritizing development interventions in Malawi. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Salim. Fascinating presentation. I have my questions, but I'll let Ashi ask hers first. Ashi, over to you.
Yeah, Salim, a great presentation indeed. And it's very fascinating to know about the NPC because in India too, we had, national development planning agencies and all. So my first question to you is like, how is there any targeted year wherein all these, you know, policies will be implemented or finished? And secondly, how the MPC thinks about implementing these policies apart from, just because don't you think it's too ambitious of a policy where they are focusing on too much, such as, economy, even sustainability and everything, knowing the agricultural space in Malawi? Yeah.
Yeah, no, thank you very much. That's a very interesting question. I mean, I forgot to say that at the beginning that there's a version of this project that was done in India, actually on Bjorn Lomborg's book, the cover page. I think it's the Prime Minister of I forget what jurisdiction that does a recommendation for him. So India actually did do this, I think, in certain provinces or regions, and it did it before it came to Malawi. So that was actually part of the motivation for us doing it in Malawi. But to answer your question, think of this research evidence as a food menu. So you go to a restaurant and you are a minister of education and you are saying, hey, like, what can I do with the money that have been allocated by the ministry, the Minister of Finance? We are coming in to say, I mean, these are a few options you could consider. And if with the same amount of money, if you put it in this area, these are the dividends, that will accrue. So it's not necessary that each of the BCRs that we compute should be pursued, but it's more or less of a decision metric in terms of how you decide, given in a limited fiscal space, which ones to pursue. We, from the 10-year implementation plan that we're implementing now as a national 10-year implementation plan that we're implementing as a country, also picked a few interventions from this research evidence. Not everything, but some of the high, returns given interventions. But development planning has an objective economic component, but there's a political aspect of it. But we tried to pull in as much of the evidence informed, best things to do as much as possible. So yeah.
Awesome. Parikshit, over to you.
Very much. Thank you so much, Salim. Some great stuff, an amazing presentation. Am I audible? Hello?
We can hear you, Parikshit. We can hear you.
Oh, okay. Yeah. So I'm working on a project in South Sudan. I guess both of us are from the sub-Saharan region. So I just wanted to check what does Kwacha mean? Sorry, you're on mute, Salim.
Yeah, Kwacha is the equivalent of a rupee.
Okay, sorry. The currency.
Currency.
Yes.
Yeah.
And one question that I had was not too educated on the political stability and the social contract in Malawi. How is it? Are there any civil wars or political instability over there that were roadblocks for your interventions?
Yeah, I mean, and political civil stability is usually a good thing. I think for us it's used in a derogatory sense because since 1964, when we attained independence, we've never really had a civil war. But we make like five bottom most poorest countries in the world, so it's used as a joke. But we're a fairly peaceful nation. We're called the warm heart of Africa. A few civil demonstrations here and there, nothing too much to really not put us where we're supposed to be.
Yeah.
Interesting. Thank you, Salim. I shall reach out to you offline. You might have some overlap and
Yes, most definitely.
Yeah, been some learnings from you. Thank you.
So, Salim, amazing presentation. In fact, I met Beyond, sometime in 2018, in the state of Telangana where he was working in India. So, fascinating person. I think that this is the most interesting component of your project was to track the research uptake, and I think that is advanced level policy making practice, because not many countries, in fact most countries, do not track research update. So there are countries who just don't do as much research, then there are countries who do the research but they never track research update. And then if you're tracking research update, that I think is really really advanced level thinking. What I've done is that in the chat box I've shared a link from the Bronfenbrenner Institute of Translational Research at Cornell University. And I would be happy to connect you, really, because at the Bronfenbrenner Center, the whole idea is that how do you get research embedded into practice in a much more scientific manner. And I am super sure that they would be fascinated by the project that you're doing and would be open to collaborating in any way that they can. So that's one. The other is that you also were looking at the capacity building programs, which again is extremely, extremely necessary. I think that's a great, strength of your presentation. My only question was just out of curiosity that how, do you know the exact methodology of how do they study the impact. So when you showed those graphs towards the end, how do you actually get to know that if I put, let's say, $1 in this project rather than $1 in the other project, I would have delivered more benefits by giving $1 in project number one? How does that actually get tracked?
Yeah, no, I mean, thank you very much. I just kind of opened up the link you shared. I would definitely look it up and would be interested, I think, in connection. One of the implementing partners, the African Institute for Development Policy, where I used to work for like 3 years before I transitioned to civil service and policymaker, essentially has a focus on EIDM, so evidence-informed decision making, how to make sure that the evidence gap between generation and utilization is being met. And I mean, I'm looking at the link you shared. That is definitely an interest for the commission, and that's something I'm trying to spearhead that side. So interested in looking at connections on that front. In terms of the how you quantify the benefit cost ratios per interventions that you're suggesting. So think of it in terms of the broader framework of economic evaluations. I mean, there's cost, utility, maximization, cost-effective analysis, the whole 9 yards. And then there's cost-benefit analysis. So there's a methodological framework which the Copenhagen Consensus Center.
That's Beyond's work.
Yes, he's propagating, and ideally, they use an intervention as the unit of analysis, and within, I think, a sectoral or a policy issue question, they lay out a few interventions from looking at the context, and they quantify the costs of pursuing that intervention, and they also try to quantify the benefits that will accrue from pursuing that intervention. Now, CPA can be done ex post or ex ante. What they usually do is ex ante type, CPA. So there's a lot of economic evaluation, approaches that the methodological approach, I think, proposes in the social type and even the more governance and economic type studies. But ideally, at the end of the day, from direct monetary costs, you just use the monetary metric, but then you also monetize different benefits that will accrue and even different costs. And then they do the BCR, which is essentially the benefits divided by the costs, and it gives you the benefit cost ratio. So those graphs yes.
I think, earlier when I had met Beyond, my only critique of his work, and that still stands right now, is that, when you're doing, let's say, I'm going to give a very simplistic example. Let us say that I put money in, rejuvenating water tanks in a particular rural area, or I have to put money on, let us say, putting, solar panels in that particular area. Now, if the claim is that giving money to rejuvenate, the water tanks gets more benefit to the people, what you're not doing is that, let's say, let me just if I'm putting money here, how do I know it's not impacting this thing as well? Or how do I know that the people who are getting impacted is exactly because of this and not because of knock-on effects of some other place? So those interconnections are probably not as well studied under the CCS Copenhagen Consensus Forum framework, because they don't do randomized control trials. So that was just one small, critique. But otherwise, I think this is fascinating and very well done.
Yeah, no, I mean, I hear you. I think he might concede to certain methodological weaknesses in the CCC methodology. I'll be sure to tell him when he comes next week. We're launching a book and he's doing a public lecture with the commission.
Oh, cool. Nice.
Yeah.
Awesome. So without further ado, let us move to our next speaker, Leah Rachel. Ria, who's a scholarship PhD candidate in constitutional law, human rights, and legislative studies at the Transitional Justice Institute at Ulster University. Leah, over to you.
Thanks so much. Conscious of the different time zones, so hello everyone, and thank you very much for this opportunity. I'm just going to start my presentation. Can I just check, please, if those are visible? Perfect, thank you. So today I am going to give you a whistle-stop tour of a very interesting field of research I find with regards to understanding diplomacy and cooperation between civil society and the UN Treaty Monitoring System. It's emerged within my current PhD research project. So by way of some context as to what I'll be talking about today, you may or may not be aware that in Northern Ireland, we have a devolved government system, and there are certain areas that are devolved in terms of policy and law. Human rights arguably are not, and also are devolved, which is why it's complicated. But the former law governing termination of pregnancy in Northern Ireland previously was one of the most restrictive, not just in Europe, but in the world. And the UN CEDAW Committee, which is the Committee for the Convention for the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women, had regularly received submissions from civil society bodies expressing concern as to the human rights impact on women and girls in Northern Ireland because of the restrictions of the former law. Now, Northern Ireland governance, unfortunately, is incredibly unstable, and we are currently going through a cycle of not having a functioning government. But between 2017 to 2020, the devolved institutions did not sit. And that was seen as a real vacuum, not just for policy, law, and governance, but for addressing key human rights concerns, of which abortion access was one. And civil society then decided to turn its view towards two strands, the UK Parliament in London and the International Treaty Monitoring System, particularly the UN CEDAW Committee. So this is just a quick track stream to show you how we're at today, the current situation in Northern Ireland today. In 2018, a Labour MP decided, after having been lobbied by civil society, that they would try to change the law via intervention from London. That was Stella Creasy. The law ultimately did change in 2019, and that's how we have Section 9 of the Northern Ireland Executive Formation Act of 2019 stipulates that UN CEDAW Committee recommendations must be implemented in law in Northern Ireland, and it's the UK government that has oversight. But for me, I was very interested, and I had three hypotheses, or I suppose three questions about this situation. Did the international system listen to civil society as well on regards to abortion access and the human rights issues arising from same? To what extent did UN CEDAW Committee in particular listen to civil society? And was there any change over time? I've talked about 2017 to 2020, but what about in the period before then? What was the position of the UN CEDAW Committee with regards to abortion access? So the aims of my paper was to look at what I've termed diplomacy and cooperation between the domestic and the international in the context of the UN Treaty Monitoring System, particularly civil society submissions, so local NGOs, for example, and charities, in the design of committee recommendations, the recommendations that are put to government at the end of each cycle when the committee will review the government's compliance with the provisions of its treaties. And I wanted then to look at, around that, what influencing role did international human rights treaties in this context facilitate legal reform? And my key question was, to what extent have the recommendations of the UN CEDAW Committee facilitated legal reform in Northern Ireland? And this is not something that is brand new. In fact, it's actually a very current piece, contemporary piece of research in terms of positioning. Various scholars have talked about how treaty monitoring bodies are responsible for widening human rights access in countries. Sampras and Gear, for example, have really looked at how UN CEDAW has enabled the expansion of international rights standards in domestic contexts because of the recommendations that the committee has produced over time. Equally, scholarship has noted there has been a real growth in civic participation in the international monitoring procedure, particularly the role of civil society. which they've called human rights experimentalism, try saying that without coffee, experimentalism. And scholars have also looked at this sense of the role of participation in the ratification of treaties, but also the reporting and the recommendations that are produced at the end of the cycle. So we can see that the treaty system itself contributes to the expansion of human rights access, but it's also the aspect of direct participation within the system, listening to grassroots organisations and having their voices feed through in the process. So for my research, I looked at all the cycles that the UK has been subjected to date with the UNCEDAW, and I was coding specifically for references to Northern Ireland. So there were two strands of this research: examining all the submissions submitted by civil society organisations during those cycles to the UNCEDAW committee, and to see in what context they referenced Northern Ireland and in what way did they frame the discourse around abortion. And then secondly, looking at the outputs from the UNCEDAW committee and then doing that comparative case analysis. With regards to the civil society submissions, I could only look at the 5th and 6th, 7th and 8th cycles, as those are the only cycles which these submissions are available online. And you can notice a very interesting trend. Overall, there are always going to be more submissions that don't reference Northern Ireland than those that do, and it tends to be local organisations in Northern Ireland, not other civil society organisations in the UK, making reference to abortion access. But you can see there is an increase in each cycle with references to Northern Ireland, and particularly in terms of specific references to abortion. There is an interesting dip in that trend in the 7th cycle, and that's because the Northern Ireland government had previously said it would look at and consult on reforming its own law. So civil society's submissions dipped because they felt the issue was going to be resolved domestically and they didn't need to flag it to the international system. But by the 8th cycle, which took place in 2018, it was apparent that wasn't going to happen. And we see this surge in the submissions that reference Northern Ireland and abortion law particularly. But what does that mean for the UN committee output? So those submissions I alluded to, initially they had spoken very generally with regards to the context of Northern Ireland until that 8th cycle where we saw the increase in submissions, but there were also the increase in more detailed submissions about Northern Ireland. With regard to the UNCEDAW committee outputs, we can see, so I'll just move soon from my screen here, we can see a similar trend. Initially, the committee made very brief and very vague recommendations and comments. And I should note, a comment tends to be when the committee wants to express concern about something, and that usually means there'll be a recommendation around that. So the 5th and 6th cycle, the UNCEDAW committee did draw lightly on the submissions that were put to it, but the comments and recommendations, as I say, were very vague. However, at the very end, as you can see here, the 8th cycle, that changes dramatically. We have 4 comments, 4 incredibly specific comments that literally copy what the submissions from the civil societies who had referenced Northern Ireland say, almost word for word, to the tone and to the letter. The recommendations are also incredibly specific, and they actually call on the UK government to directly legislate for abortion access in Northern Ireland to comply with its human rights standards, which had not happened before. So that's why I want to really focus in on the 8th cycle and that very, very specific recommendation. Remember, it's not about the number of recommendations, it's the actual content of those recommendations. So to go back to those 3 hypotheses then, did the international system listen to civil society on abortion access? The evidence suggests that it did. And that we noticed there's a trend, the more recent cycles, that has become much more apparent. The wording, the framing, the discourse is heavily influenced by the submissions from civil society that reference Northern Ireland. To what extent, again, that has been apparent, and particularly in the most recent cycles. The 9th cycle is currently underway, and I would anticipate, based on these findings, that that trend will continue as there continue to be human rights issues with abortion in Northern Ireland. And did this change over time? It did. We can see with that comparative analysis, the submissions from civil society, when they were talking about abortion access in Northern Ireland, only resulted in quite vague comments and quite vague recommendations in the 5th, 6th and 7th cycles. However, the drastic change came in the 8th cycle when the CEDAW committee listened fully to the submissions that it received from civil society. Therefore, I would argue it demonstrates not just the potential of the international system to ensure that there's modification of law, but the potential of the system as an actual maybe dialogue and channel communication with civil society to hear what the reality is on the ground with regards to the provisions of these treaties in human rights contexts. So thank you very much for listening, and I'm happy to take any questions that you might have.
Great, great presentation, Leah. If there are any questions, then we'll take them first, and then I will have my comments. Okay, James, over to you.
Thank you, Leah, for your presentation and everything regarding to the concern that is going on in the tensions going on within your country regarding to this abortion issues. I think this is probably also a big issue that is going on within my country, in this case, the US, where just last year, if I remember clearly, they actually overturned the Roe versus Wade decision, because now they're saying they have a different interpretation of how they viewed on that abortion rights, which obviously now it's now gone. In my home state in Georgia, they completely decided to get rid of it, signed by my governors from the state of government, from my governor's office. In this case, obviously, so I think from what I can understand is that from my country right now, from every different 50 states have their own regulation on how they're going to deal and address this issue. So the question is right now, so how concerned are you regarding to this issue could spur out of control, where it could be a global issue where various countries will start to get debate about this and whether it's going to be they're going to be for or not. How concerned is this for you, either as personally or based on the research, where the trending is going to? Are we going to see a lot of potentially going to be tensions within a political system or societal system where potentially they will not getting to agree with them certain issues, or could potentially there could be a solution, but there has been a lot of challenges to address those concerns, because I think in our political system they're having some difficulties on how to address this issue. I think that's the one concern that I have. But I'll leave it up to you, obviously, how you think we should address it, and what do you think the trajectory is going to be in the next for the future years for that.
Thanks so much, James. I think that's a very apt question. And I suppose I'm an international human rights scholar insofar as I always think that we should start from the standards that these treaties set out. And I do stress that these treaties set out minimum standards. They are the standards that states should have as a minimum, and then states can freely build upon. The interesting thing in the context of the United States is that it is not a state signatory to UN CEDAW, and as such cannot be evaluated on its compliance with those provisions under the UN CEDAW committee's cycles. Having said that, I think this stems to a wider question around the real role of the international system, because reports that are produced or for the cycles or for investigatory reports that are produced by committees, not just UN CEDAW, they are not enforceable. They're not binding. It's entirely up to state governments or federal governments to, in terms of what they want to implement and how far they wish to implement them. And, I suppose that's the beauty and the curse of the international system, right? And in the context of that, which you say around the United States not almost backsliding on human rights concerns, absolutely that is, I would say, a trend. There are concerns around abortion provision in the United Kingdom more widely. Actually, we've had more women being prosecuted in Great Britain in the last 2 years than have been in the last 30 to 40 years. And it really does seem to stem from the political motivations and the political positioning, I think, of the sitting governments of the day, more so than anything else. And yet we've also seen great progress be made in different states in Mexico, for example, and Argentina around their perception of abortion in particular as being a human rights issue and a human rights matter. So I think it's a very mixed bag. We have seen some great progress, particularly following that line of it is a human rights concern and using the provisions of UN CEDAW to achieve that. And then we also have seen some quite scary and quite sinister backsliding. And I think it stems from as well that there is no actual right to abortion. Article 12 of UNCEDAW talks about reproductive and sexual healthcare access. It does not stipulate abortion. So for those governments who want to backslide, they can argue, well, under international law, there is an abortion. It has had to be read into. The one good thing I would say is that the UNCEDAW committee has become much more radical in recent years. And when I say recent, I say the last 20 years. Previously, it wouldn't have tried to read into provisions to find matters that previously weren't considered human rights matters. And that's been a work in progress. So UNCEDAW will now talk much more, starkly about abortion, whereas 20 years ago it wouldn't have. So I think as the international system evolves and there is greater understanding about abortion in the human rights context, hopefully that can maybe trickle down to states, depending on the governments in question. But ultimately, the real concern is that we are seeing evidence of the change and the slide away, and the international system can't quite catch up. It does not have those enforcement powers or real, powers of forced implementation. It really comes down to the state. So it's probably not quite the answer you wanted, but that's probably the best summary of the issue I think I can give to you at this time. But thank you very much for your question.
I do appreciate it, Leah. I think the final word for it is that this should be a moral humanity issue, and it shouldn't be politicized at all, obviously. I don't know why politicians are making it so complicated on this, but it is ridiculous. They're trying to obviously divide this issue completely, and this should be obviously the individual issue that should be taken care of by the individuals and not by the governments completely. But that's all on my final word for that, obviously, to end up with that comment.
So Leah, again, fascinating presentation. I also think that, in spirit, some aspects of it were also connected to Salim's presentation, in the sense that, when you were tracking that how much of civil society participation has been voiced, that's again a very, applied translational research question, which is super interesting to me. I am just curious about the fact that, why do you think that the comments became more richer and the recommendations became more specific in the 8th cycle?
From the UNCEDAW committee, thanks so much for the question. And by the way, just to say as a caveat, I could easily talk about this for half an hour, so I'll try to be very
Okay,
succinct. But essentially, I think it's a combination of factors. So firstly, as I said, UNCEDAW there's a trend of it becoming much more radical in terms of how it sees its job and how willing or how far it's willing to go in terms of the recommendations it puts to governments. Taking a step back from CEDAW specifically, all UN committees in recent years have developed a trend as well of, when they find themselves making the same recommendation to a state over repeated cycles, they get a bit more brisker with their language, as if to say, this has been the 3rd time in 12 years and we're fed up of saying it. So that's definitely a factor as well. And I think the 3rd and final factor really stems from the fact that when you have more evidence coming through from civil society, the committee members have a better understanding of the political, legal, social, and policy frameworks in place. And because bearing in mind, committee members are academics, they're not politicians, they're appointed because of their expertise, and they're not experts in every governance system of their states. So whenever we see that increase in civil society submissions, which was a deliberate, campaign from the ground in the recognition of the absence of Northern Ireland government and to put pressure on the UK government, there was more of an understanding given to committee members about the context in Northern Ireland. And I think that's why they became more willing to understand that they couldn't just say the Northern Ireland government should review something because there wasn't a government, and they couldn't just say the UK government should review something when it was a glaring issue. So they actually framed it as the onus is on the UK government and it should step in and legislate, and under international law it has every right to, notwithstanding that, yes, there is devolved government in Northern Ireland, but in international law, it's the state government that has responsibilities for the treaty, and that's the UK government. And I think that also then brings us back to the first point, that sense of being more radical and more willing to be more clear and more direct, I think, than previous committees would have been.
So, I mean, what would be a very interesting, political psychology research would be that how some of these international agencies like UNCDOR can become more committed, or what you're saying, more radical. So what are the psychosocial processes that make them so? And then what are the resultant effects of in international relations in terms of conflicts? That's almost like a will to power, that how committed is a nation towards a particular cause. And I think similar lenses could be applied to understanding that, does the social and psychological coming together of the minds in a particular international organization lead to certain knock-on effects on real policy on the ground? So I think that's a really, really interesting point that I would take away from this. So thank you, Leah.
Thank you very much.
Okay, and last but not the least, we have our fellow Abhinandan, who would be presenting today. Abhinandan Khajuria is a research analyst at the Council on Energy, Environment and Water, CEEW, in India. He's a public policy professional eager to contribute to sustainable change through policy research and data-driven objective approach. He holds keen interest in clean tech, sustainability, and similar fields, and has been somewhat of a regular co-author with me on a lot of our pieces on space policy. So, Abhinandan, glad to see you here. Over to you. Before I hand it over to Abhinandan, we were also slotted for a presentation by Kavita, who's an assistant government pleader, mediator, and counselator at the High Court of Mumbai and notary of Government of India. Kavita has sent her presentation and recording, but she's not here in person. So in the interest of time, we will just email you the presentation and recording for you to see. And Kavita's email ID is also something we'll share with you, so that if anybody has any questions or comments, you can directly get in touch with Kavita. Now, without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Abhinandan. Over to you. We can't hear you, Abhinandan. No, I think if you might want to remove your earphones, we might be able to hear you. Sometimes the mic doesn't catch us. I mean, if you just plug it out.
Yeah, I have plugged it out.
Yeah.
Am I audible?
Now we can hear. Now we can hear you. Yes.
Yeah. So, thanks for the kind introduction, Arpit. I'm Abhinandan, and I work at a sustainability think tank, focusing on clean technology sustainability, and basically looking at the public policy aspect of it. And I was very intrigued by Tristan's presentation, and specifically how climate change can impact basically facets of life across domains. So that has been very helpful. So I'll kindly share my presentation right now with you all. So I'm looking at a particular aspect of climate change and energy transition, which has widely been ignored in specifically in the global south, and which is very important with respect to achieving energy transitions that we want to do with respect to development of renewable energy deployment, as well as electric vehicles uptake around the world. And that would be the need for critical minerals. So basically, what are critical minerals? These are those minerals uh, which are very limited in supply, as well as very expensive to extract, but are critical to clean technologies as well as other processing needs in sectors such as pharmaceuticals and defense. Moving forward, so clean technology is what drives these minerals, and according to various scenarios in which the world intends to reach to net zero targets, such as the announced pledges scenario, the demand for critical minerals will double by 2030. According to the net zero emission scenario, the growth will be 3.5 times the current demand in 2030. And lastly, the market size in 2022 specifically with respect to these transitional minerals was USD 320 billion, which is a huge market size for that impact. Moving on, you can look at this figure and you can see that there are various clean technologies such as solar, wind, electric vehicles, grid storage batteries, as well as electricity networks, which utilize these metals. And this diagram specifically refers to copper, nickel, as well as cobalt and how they are used. Specifically, if it's not visible clearly, I'd like to point out that electric vehicles basically hold a large chunk of these clean minerals with respect to nickel and cobalt being used as elements in the lithium ion batteries and other chemistries used in EVs. Moving forward, there is a volatility with respect to how the markets with respect to critical minerals operate around the world. The volatility comes from price as well as geographical concentrations, which leads to supply chain constraints. For example, Bolivia is the largest deposits of lithium around the world. China holds 79% of graphite production, and Democratic Republic of Congo holds 49% of cobalt reserves around the world. So you see, specific part of the supply chain of these critical minerals are basically concentrated in specific geographical location, and therefore global trade as well as global deployment of clean technology is crucially dependent upon certain geographies to work and function properly. And prices of these minerals were also very volatile due to the supply chain concentration. As you can see on the right hand side, there is a price increase in battery grade lithium, cobalt, nickel, as well as copper. Specifically, see the price rise between July 2020 and July 2022 for battery grade lithium, which is almost 550% increase. This was a mixture of results from the coming of COVID, as well as recession around the world, as well as the opening up of various wars around the world, specifically some in Africa, as well as the Russian-Ukraine war. Moving forward, there are certain countries, especially in the West, which have basically taken critical minerals very seriously and have devised policies around it. And there are certain countries such as India and Japan, which are basically developing policies for critical minerals. Countries which are rich in mineral resources, such as Canada, Australia, have developed critical minerals policy and strategy, as well as financing and investment opportunities, which are funded from taxpayers' money and from the public's exchequer. EU has recently come up with its critical minerals framework, and UK and United States have also done the same. But peculiarly, two of the Quad members, India and Japan, have partially implemented the critical minerals strategy, and they are weak on public financing and investment for the sector. Although the demand for critical minerals is very important in Japan and India, given that both countries are deploying solar at a larger scale. Specifically, we should know that India has recently come up with the 30 critical mineral list, but still there is no sight of a policy in question. On the other hand, towards maturity, we see the United Kingdom, which not only has a critical mineral policy, but also has an intelligence center for specifically for critical minerals, which serves as an R&D center, as well as data gathering and intelligence center for critical mineral mining, processing, as well as deployment for UK's interest areas. Moving forward, these minerals are important, but there is also social cost attached to it. To give you an anecdotal evidence, cobalt is a very critical mineral used in production of EV batteries, but the countries in Africa from where cobalt is mined, there are very not so good conditions with respect to employment, and also underage labor is deployed in those mines which mine cobalt in Africa. And so to speak, with regard to this, basically the critical mineral sector will only improve if they improve their ESG matrices. As you can see across these minerals, majority of them score low on governance as well as emission intensity. Emission intensity essentially referring to throughout the value chain of these minerals, how much carbon is needed to make sure that they are basically sourced from a mine and into your EVs. And for that regards, for example, see cobalt. It has a low governance score as well as a low emission intensity score in terms of ESG, meaning that extraction as well as deployment of cobalt in EV batteries is not an ethical value chain business proposition as such, and therefore companies should look to basically improve their processing in that regard. You can also see copper has a high governance score and low emission intensity. This is because the copper market is more developed and diverse, and not only just caters to the clean technology, but also to the overall electricity infrastructure around the world, as we know that copper is utilized in electricity wires, so to speak. So we see that there is a social cost attached to critical minerals. There is a demand incentive for the players around the world, and countries are moving forward to that respect. So what would essentially be needed in the future to make sure that critical minerals are deployed in an ethical way and also meet the energy transition demand that the world requires to make sure that we have a cleaner environment in the future? It starts with ethical sourcing that as I mentioned in the previous slide. After that, I would say we will refer to uh, one second. Yeah, diversification of supply chain, which essentially means that not only from Bolivia, China, or Democratic Republic of Congo, you have to source supply chain materials for these critical minerals from different sources. Thirdly, would be innovation in clean tech to reduce critical mineral content. For example, there could be new chemistries and new innovation in batteries, which are deployed in EVs, so to speak, which don't utilize critical minerals. And as such, the demand for these minerals and their mining proposition would greatly be reduced in the future. Next would be ESG considerations. They should also rank high in social indicators as well as governance indicators, such as reporting with respect to how these mining companies are sourcing these materials. And lastly, I would like to have a special emphasis on recycling and reuse, especially with regards to EV batteries and how they can be utilized for their second life in stationary storage and other application, as well as extracting valuable critical minerals such as lithium and cobalt from used batteries and making sure that they become a part of the larger circular economy in the clean energy value chain. Thank you for your time, and I'm open to your questions.
Thank you so much, Abhinandan. Really, well put together presentation, and to the point, very nicely done. If anybody else has questions, I'll take them first, then I'll come to mine. James, yes, over to you.
Yes, I don't know how to pronounce your name, but apologies for that. But I do appreciate your presentation regarding to the sustainability on all of the different technology and a lot of different sustainability efforts of trying to meet the demands, as you were saying, to move into the EV market, like what we were. Well, I think that's essentially what I was talking about regarding to the Inflation Reduction Act. I think for the ESG consideration, I think for that, I'm not saying it's a concern, but in my country, in the United States, there has been I would say a huge political backlash and a huge tensions. It goes back to what I kept saying to other presenters over and over again on this idea of this, because of the indifferences on the culture wars that were obviously drifting one way to the other, because people are not willing to adapt to the new, whether it's cultural changes or societal technological changes and so on and so forth. Unfortunately, the companies, especially in the country, in the United States, in the context of that, they're not willing to move forward to ESG for whatever reason is. And that goes back to what I was talking about, the woke culture, which, okay, I don't buy into that. That's the politicization, what's causing this, a lot of polarization. I'm not sure if other countries are experiencing it, but I think that's intolerated to the point that it should not be the discussion of making decision what the companies should be in the context of what we should do for making a future decision making going on forward. Because if they're obviously keep bogging on that too much to the point that, okay, because I don't agree on certain things, I'm not going to be, agree with it or whatever the decision making that could be. And there could be a lack of progress. And that is a concern deeply onto me, as well as within the business community, because that is the thing that really, really concerns a lot. And I'm not sure if there has been some progress regarding to your home country, whether obviously are for the ESG, and whether the business community are obviously starting to saying that they are obviously ready for this, for the ESG consideration. I just want to get into your conversation on that, whether that is obviously happening, and whether you think that ESG could be the reality of how we can make the metrics, the performance on the companies, but also social and the local community, how we could bring together on those solutions in regard to that.
So thank you, James, for your question. So regarding the US policy, I know there has been a lot of friction between the two factions of the Democrats and the Republicans with respect to how ESG is moving. But when we specifically talk about hardware components of batteries and specifically talk about how EV space is going to change, I think ESG consideration should be looked at more holistically from the net effects of the market, considering the global supply chain. So the United States, some states might not be too keen on ESG, but maybe California is, and that is what matters, because IRA would draw majority of the capital would be drawn towards California. Secondly, it would be, even if the United States doesn't take seriously ESG from, for example, at a scale of 1 to 10, takes it at a level of 5, we know for a fact that EU will take it at a level of 7. So in that respect, the net effects of ESG would be on a positive side rather than a negative side when we consider the global value chains of batteries or global value chain of clean technologies. Regarding India, I think the conversation has started slowly, but I think we have been making progress with respect to ESG, with obviously the business regulation coming in, which requires mandatory compliance from companies with respect to their outlay in making sure that ESG matrices are basically covered. But that is just a very niche and a very limited market which has not developed over time. It is more developed in EU and the United States, or Australia or Canada, so to speak. And I think, in my opinion, and as far as the research that I have done with respect to this, every policy which each country has come about with respect to critical minerals, clean technologies, have specific mentions of ESGs and how it should be done. I think from what perspective you are coming from is with respect to how the markets and the financial gurus and the hedge markets looks at ESG as a hedging mechanism to make sure that they get disproportionate returns on their investment based on some virtue signaling with respect to ESG or stuff like that. But I think when you go deeper and dig deeper, the basically outliers and the fallacies we clear out, and the hard ESG aspect of it, the companies which know how to make impact and which source their material from countries which are not so good regime wise, they know that there is a need to move towards more ethical sourcing and ESG considerations. Yeah.
I totally agree with that, your statement, and obviously making sure that it needs to be much more collaborative framework, and rather than obviously splintered approach where obviously some people will agree or not. But I do appreciate it for your time and your presentation and everything. I appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you, James. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Abhinandan. Ashi has a question, so I'm gonna hand it over to you, Ashi.
Thank you for the presentation, Abhinandan. Being an analyst in the CEW, I want to raise a question. As you have mentioned that India is really lagging behind in terms of EU and US. So what do you think that India's first step should be? I mean, recently if we see the policies of the government, we are still focusing on EVs right now. We are not even talking about reusing or, recycling those batteries. And also the fact that recently we're coming up with a policy of ethanol blended petroleum and diesels and all. So why do you think that India is lagging behind in all these things, and what do you think is the way forward for India? Like, do you think how many years will India take coming into this process? That's my question. Thank you.
Technologies, I think the train is moving pretty fast. With respect to my think tank, I and our conversation with the government stakeholders, there have been impetus to make sure that we are at least at parity with the EU and the US, and there have been benchmark studies with respect to that. With respect to recycle and reuse, I think we are lagging behind the same reason that any other country would. Is that there is not enough deployment of EVs or enough deployment of clean technologies in India. For example, these companies like Ather and Ola just came up in about last 5 years with respect to this. Whenever we will reach a critical mass of EVs on the ground, we will see this recycle and repurposing of batteries that would likely happen. And also there is a secondary market that has already developed in India with respect to how batteries such as lead acid and lithium ion batteries, which are wasted, basically are converted into a specific material which is then shipped to EU so that they can be secondarily used in the EU. So that for that secondary market has already developed without much of a policy impetus from the government. But with respect to this, I think the government is moving pretty fast, and pretty soon, probably in 1 or 2 years, they will come up with new recycling and repurposing rule for batteries and clean technologies. With respect to the parity, with respect to other climatic policies, I think EU has been an outlier around the world, not only with respect to India or any other country in the global south. They have been more far-reaching and more forthcoming with respect to their environmental policies as compared to the United States, for example, or Australia for that respect. So in that matters, I would say that the only thing is that power comes from people, and if people are active and they know what they want, they will definitely, from a systems point of view, demand that, and obviously the policymakers have to consider that. In India, that demand is not there because there are other things to look at to from the perspective of people. But I think there is a critical mass of environmentalists as well as policy think tanks which are basically advocating for more stringent rules on environment and making sure that we comply with ESG and other sustainability facets of in our policy ecosystem. And I think things would move pretty much faster than it has moved in the previous decade. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your insights. Thank you.
Thanks, Abhinandan. I have two very quick questions. Number one is that what do you mean by how do you categorize critical mineral strategy being partial? What
Yeah.
are the gradations over there?
So if you benchmark critical mineral strategies or policies about what the government has been doing, so you can basically bucket into three parts. Is that there is a basically policy statement from a government that there's a long-term overview with respect to what they want to do in critical minerals. Then there is a critical mineral strategy, which can be terms at a policy brief, so to speak, about what is the country's plan in the short term and medium term. And then there is a critical minerals policy, which basically outlines the outcomes as well as the deliverables with regards to critical minerals policy. So in India, we have achieved only the first step. There is
And then I would think there also has to be an implementation plan as a fourth.
Yeah, implementation plan as a whole, as well as a basically assessment mechanism as to where we are standing currently right now. In that respect, India and Japan are lagging. For example, UK does not only have a strategy and a policy, they have intelligence unit for critical minerals, which basically makes sure that their deployment needs are met, and they basically help the market in making sure that they have secured their supply of critical minerals. Similarly, the thing goes for Australia and Canada, which are market leaders in mining production, as the mining contributes a large chunk of their GDP. So in that regards, India and Japan needs to move. And as you know that the Quad summit is coming up in Jan and Feb, I think this is one of the pillars in which both countries will likely work in the future. The four countries would likely work. Yeah.
Thank you. And my next question is that what defines the governance scores that you talked about on cobalt and governance scores on those bar graphs where you were showing different minerals, and
so basically
yellow was the governance score there? Yeah.
So basically, there are these metrics, benchmarking companies such as Merilytics, with, for example, which basically give ES indicator scores to companies. So in cobalt, for example, governance score would be the score which has been attributed to the company, for example, Rio Tinto from Brazil, which would be involved in mining as well as processing of cobalt. So if you are giving a medium-term score to that company, it essentially means that Rio Tinto is not so great at basically making sure that they are complying with the local provision of that jurisdiction in which they are mining.
Got it. So to the degree to which they are cognizant and compliant of
local laws and local governance frameworks. Yeah.
Okay, got it. Okay, very interesting, Abhinandan. Fascinating work. So
thank you.
With this, we come to the end of our first GPOD Speak session. I think that this is particularly useful because we all get to know about what each one of us is working on, and we all get to share knowledge and hopefully build bridges for future collaboration. So this is how good policies propagate and increase. Good policy making culture expands. So I have to thank the members of our current GPODS cohort. So Leah, particularly for floating this idea, and then Ashi, Tristan for supporting and promoting this idea. Uh, you know, Salim for also supporting this idea very much, and to our alums who took the initiative to also jump back in and share their researches. This is something that as GPODS we will continue on doing. So this is your contribution to a new GPODS tradition that we will have for each of the cohorts now. Thank you so much once again, and we look forward to having you again on the next GPOD Speak session. So thank you so much, and have a nice day, evening, afternoon, wherever you are. Thank you. Bye-bye.